Hello, everyone, and welcome. So today, my name is Anubhav Madan, and I am the head of contract compliance and optimization here at LGP, and I will be your MC for today. To start off, I will begin with acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of this land. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. To begin, we're very pleased to have you all here in this latest webinar on stabilizing council's energy spend. I'm joined here by Iberdrola, who's leading our first 100% renewable energy contract that is commencing in January 2023. Today we have a lot of people from council. We have 58 different councils represented and over 100 people who have registered. So it is going to be a very interesting session. Just as a bit of housekeeping, please do turn off your microphones. It just becomes a bit awkward when we are hearing you and things in your background compared to everything else. So just please do switch off your microphone. Please do type in your first name and family name in the window with your profile so that we just know who you are and we can see your questions. There will be time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions, please feel free to use the chat button and put in your questions, and we will be asking some questions at the end. So today what we'll do is we will first start off with a bit of an introduction for Iberdrola. Then we'll look at what's going on in the market, and then we'll just end off with a few questions. So with that, we'll just get started. To help introduce Iberdrola, we've got James, who is the general manager of Iberdrola. He's managing the retail sales division of the business. James also has an excess of 14 years of experience in the energy industry, including retail, generation, and consulting. He has extensive experience working with and for customers, negotiating and designing complex, non-standard arrangements for large energy user accounts in the national electricity market. So James will help introduce Iberdrola to us. James.
Morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. Just as a quick intro, so my name is James McKell. I'm the General Manager of Sales at Iberdrola Australia. Been lucky enough to work in the industry for sort of 14 or 15 years, and a lot changes year to year, let alone sort of in that amount of time. So it's been a very interesting space to work. My sort of role at Iberdrola essentially is to, from a very high level, get a way to get our generation from our wind farms and our solar farms to sort of customers like councils. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a bit of perfect, thank you. Just a bit of a sort of an overview of our very brief history. So we've been in this generation market quite a while. You might be familiar with the previous business that we were, which is Infigen Energy. So our role was basically a developer of wind farms, and we'd sell that power to the market by very long-term PPA arrangements or very short-term to the spot market. So about 5.5 years ago, when I joined the business, our strategy shifted a bit to become a retailer. So we've gone from being a developer now to we call it a gen-tailer, so a generator and a retailer. So our footprint is basically in the eastern states. So essentially in New South Wales specifically, we've got wind farms in the Dangra, which is out near Wellington. We've got the Capital and Woodlawn wind farms, which is sort of down near Lake George. As you're driving down to Canberra on the left over the lake there. And we are building a number of other assets in New South Wales that I will get to. We've also got footprint in South Australia, where we have wind farms there and utility scale batteries. We have agreements in Victoria and development stage assets in Queensland. So focus today will be predominantly on New South Wales, which is where councils are located. Next slide, please. So for us, talking about Iberdrola specifically, we became part of the Iberdrola family in 2020. So we rebranded as Iberdrola Australia in May 2021. Who is Iberdrola? Iberdrola is a huge global, predominantly renewables business. So some quick stats you can see on your screen. Operate in sort of the Americas and Central America. Second largest private PPP in Mexico. big in distribution, so essentially poles and wires in Brazil, and very large in offshore wind farms sort of around the UK, and very huge, a lot of wind and solar in Spain. What's not on this sort of slide is, the things that we focus on outside of, purely just developments. Some things that sort of Iberdrola is very large on overseas is sort of behind the meter initiatives. So they focus on things like essentially heat, VPPs, EVs, essentially anything you can do to do smarts in the home. And what we're looking to do here, they're quite advanced in those stages overseas, but what we're looking to do is essentially bring that capability to Australia. So we've always been, at the forefront of sort of the generation side, which we call in front of the meter. For us moving forward, and I'll talk about our strategy in a moment, it's what can we start doing as a value add when an energy contract is already in place. What's it meant for our business, being part of the Iberdrola family? It's really good for us because we've now got, financial backing to really push forward with our strategy, which is, from a very high level, is to build more renewable and firming assets in Australia and push the sort of level of renewables up in our grid, in our market. I'm sure you've heard a lot in the news lately around what's happening on sort of other technologies in the Australian market. I'm sure Tim will touch on a bit of that in his presentation, but look, that's our general strategy. How can we build more renewables and how can we get that to end customers? But yeah, what it's meant from our business specifically is we've grown our headcount by about 150%. The last 2 years, we've grown our customer count by about 100%. So it's really enabled us to grow as a business and put those sort of contracts in place as a headline. But then our next sort of key to our strategy is what's the value add after that contract goes in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so for us, what we're focusing on in the sort of short to mid-term, I guess we split it into two elements. On the development side, so we're currently building a number of assets in New South Wales. So the Flyers Creek Wind Farm, which is just sort of outside Orange, and the Avonlea Solar Farm, which is out at Narrandera now. Very interesting time to be trying to build assets like these in rural areas, especially when it involves a lot of big machinery, digging big holes and trying to put cement everywhere for turbine foundations. And you're obviously very familiar with weather out that way. So there's some challenges that we're facing on the development front, but look, others are very much in the similar boat. But our strategy is to expand in New South Wales in addition to these assets as well, and also look into other states and not just the renewables side. How do we firm it? What can we do from, say, a large utility scale battery perspective? On the customer side, we've always been on that left column there, which is essentially electricity retail and various forms of retail contracts. It could be, standard stepped a couple of years. It's very long-term structured arrangements. And we do talk to councils more and more these days that do have those sort of renewable requirements, sort of structured long-term requirements. In late last year, we acquired a business called Autonomous Energy, which has given us basically capability in every column to the right you can see. So the key I guess part of that would be the PV, the solar PV, and all the services that sort of come around that. And our big focus as well will be mobility in this space. So yeah, as I sort of mentioned, we can certainly do retail supply to a meter. All these other aspects now we can start talking to councils about. And we're really keen to understand, from each individual council what your sort of roadmaps are, and if there's anywhere we can team or at least give some guidance, we're more than happy to chat. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, just a few specific examples for councils at the moment. And this is pretty much before our relationship with LGP councils kicked off. So, Autonomous as a business is already really active in this space. So now, it's the whole sort of 1 + 1 = 3, where previously, the Autonomous business would do the kit installs and, Iberdrola would do the green to the gate. We're now thinking, what's the value of having the two together? And really being an enabler. Our key thing is we want councils and customers to be able to do these things in their own areas behind the meter, whether it's batteries, whether it's EVs, whether it's solar car parks, and not have sort of penalties on the other side, which is generally the retail contracts. So we really want to be an enabler. We want to be a partner. And yeah, look, our strategy moving forward is just really how can we be better in this space. We're always open to feedback on what we can do. So yeah, please get in touch. That's probably my bit, and I'll introduce Jim Nelson. But before I do that, I might actually throw it to Adam, who manages the LGP portfolio, just to talk about a wind farm too we've got coming up, and then we'll go to Tim.
Thanks, James. Afternoon, everyone. As James says, my name's Adam Firmstone. Just getting ready for the camera there. My role is BD Sales and Solutions, and I'm the key contact for one of the current contracts across the councils commencing next year. Just to give you a bit of a heads up, we are organising a bit of a trip for councils who are interested on the 17th of November. We'll post some details post today's workshop, and really just to give you a bit of an overview of the intent is to go out to the wind farm, see basically the actual turbines and then the farm in the flesh, really what the contract you're commencing from next year. We'll basically be meeting in Collector. Then we'll do a number of safety briefings on the day, and then have some lunch, and then head out to the wind farm and do a site tour there. So please feel free, there are limited spots, but LGP will post that information post today's session for you, and look forward to seeing you all there. I'll hand it over to Tim Nelson.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for having me today. My, presentation is to give you a bit of a feel for some of the things to think about in the sense of the energy market, the way it's operating today, the way it'll be operating in the next few years, but also kind of some of the long-term trends we see. So the things that I wanted to talk to you about was what's driving electricity prices, because there's a lot of talk about coal and gas, but there are three key things that I think buyers of energy should always keep in the back of their mind, and they are supply and demand. What does that look like? Cost of building new generation, and then the cost of running existing generation. And that's the one which we'll focus on quite a bit. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about what's happened in the most recent winter months. There's been a lot of press reporting about it. I'll just give you a bit of a feel for kind of the way those events transpired. Being a kind of part-time academic, I've got a paper which is in second round peer review with Economic Papers that talks about what we saw in winter. Will it happen again? And using some of the existing kind of theory around what we call wounded bull coal generators. In other words, generators that don't have the characteristics of the current market and will seek to maximise profit on the way out the door, so to speak. Then a quick bit of a feel for what it looks like in New South Wales, the optimal plant mix, and then some thoughts on the current market. So I guess, firstly, what's driving electricity prices? The first thing that I'd point to is the impact of small-scale solar PV. I always say if you don't have small-scale solar PV in your personal situation, get small-scale solar PV. It's the best investment you'll ever make. Incredible payback periods. Why is that? Because we still charge households on the basis of the energy throughput, not their capacity that they use at times of peak demand. And therefore, if you install solar PV, you can avoid most of the network charges that you would incur because you're using energy behind the meter. This chart shows the incredible growth in small-scale solar PV. At the moment, I know this is a little bit out of date now, we're probably this year heading towards something like 19, 20 gigawatts of small-scale solar PV. To give you a feel for what that is, that's the equivalent of 10 Liddell coal-fired power stations by capacity. It's obviously a lot smaller than that in terms of energy, but if you think all of those solar PV units are all producing their maximum output in the middle of the day, on a day like today, depending upon where you are, I know it's not sunny everywhere, but it has a massive impact on the system. And we see this hollowing out of demand, which I think on the next slide, we can see what that looks like. So this is the South Australian market where we've seen this most pronounced effect, but it's happening everywhere. This is probably just the easiest chart to see it graphically. What is this showing? It's showing the average demand in each year across a 24-hour period. So the average across the entire year by half-hour period in a standard day. And you can see that middle of the day when the solar is producing at its maximum output, it is driving that curve further and further down. That has big implications for coal-fired power stations. Coal-fired power stations were designed to be basically switched on and operate at maximum capacity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What this impact of solar PV does is that it means that all the coal-fired power stations have to back off in the middle of the day, ramp back up at the evening. Now, they were never designed to do that. Operating in that way puts enormous stress on the boilers, and over time that results in poorer reliability figures. So the first thing I guess we talk about is the impact of this small-scale solar PV. On this chart, this now includes what happens if you include all of the large-scale PV and then the wind in South Australia. And so for the first time anywhere really in the world, a system is having to deal with what we would call non-positive minimum demand. What does that mean? There is so much renewable energy being produced, there's not enough demand in South Australia. The only way that market solves at the moment is that the interconnector that goes into Victoria is operating at increasingly maximum capacity, taking all of that surplus energy from South Australia, putting it in Victoria. Victoria is increasingly becoming very renewable as well, and so that energy then flows up into New South Wales. But as we build more and more renewables, this impact is going to become more and more pronounced through all of the states, and that's going to incentivise batteries. And so I think it's a really important part of thinking through what your individual demand looks like, because if you've got relatively stable flat demand across the day, there's a great opportunity to put solar and a battery in, or utilise a large-scale energy contract, putting in some batteries on your property. The other thing, I guess, that drives supply and demand is this withdrawal and then entry of new capacity. So you can see here there's two lines, which are the price of LGCs and the price of wholesale electricity, and then the bars going down below zero are when big coal plant has been retired, and then the renewable plant being built is on the top of those of that vertical axis. And so these are commodity markets, and ultimately they're mean reverting. So at the moment we're in a very high price period. What is that doing? It's resulting in an explosion in investment in new energy producing capacity. There are, tens and tens of new solar projects currently being built right across the East Coast NEM. There's also a bucket load of wind farms as well. Whilst we're building the Flies Creek wind farm and the Avonlea solar plant, there are also a bucket load of other participants doing the same thing. So the most important thing to remember about the energy market is that it's a commodity market. It goes up, that incentivises people to build more capacity, and then you get kind of an overreach, and then that drives the price back down. And it's a cyclical, but ultimately mean reverting market. So the other big driver of the cost of electricity is what it costs to build the new generation. So the two key things to remember here is that ultimately the costs of generating, of building a new renewable generator have generally been falling over the last 10 or 15 years. More efficiency, economies of scale, development, technology, cost development, those types of things. We have reached a point though where those economies of scale are being somewhat offset by supply chain constraints, and we're also in a rising interest rate environment. And what does that mean? Incredibly capital intensive. So for every % increase in project financing, you're looking at between a $3 and a $5 increase in the cost of generation in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. So those increasing costs over time start manifesting as a higher total amount of revenue that generators need to attract financing to get built. But it's the fuel costs that everyone wants to talk about at the moment, because these have gone through the roof. So a bit of history here is really, really important. The first thing is that domestic gas markets are now globally linked. Why is that? Because we found a bucket load of coal seam gas in Queensland. New technology, horizontal drilling, meant that all of that gas could be reasonably economically extracted. And the only market at the time, this is going back 15 years, the only market at the time was to develop an export industry. And so what this slide shows is the light green, the blue and the yellow show domestic consumption, and the dark green shows the enormous amount of gas on the East Coast now that's going out through those big LNG facilities at Gladstone, QCLNG, APLNG and GLNG. So to give you a feel for what this looks like in terms of the capacity of those LNG export facilities versus how much gas is going into them, the yellow line here shows the capacity that those terminals at Gladstone can take in the sense of the amount of gas they can export at any point in time. And you can see that the production of gas going into those facilities has never met that. So that spare capacity effectively means that there's just not enough gas. So once you take into account the capacity of the LNG trains and domestic consumption, there is literally not enough gas. And that's why gas prices on the East Coast have gone very, very high, even pre the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So you might remember, say, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot of talk that you couldn't get gas. It was being priced at $20, $25 a gigajoule. And then COVID and the global downturn hit, and that moderated. But as a consequence of the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen gas prices internationally go to levels that were previously unthought of. Historically, on the east coast of Australia, you could probably say gas was somewhere in the order of, say, $3 to $5 a gigajoule. The production cost of CFG is much higher than that. So we're looking more like $8 to $10 a gigajoule, but international prices today are somewhere in the order of around $60 a gigajoule. So it gives you a feel for the scale of those things. But the one thing that I keep coming back to is that electricity prices and gas prices are correlated. And I'll come back to why that is a bit later on in the presentation. Key point though, even if the conflict in Russia and the Ukraine ended today and all of the issues around gas supply from Russia into Europe were solved immediately, the production cost of gas on the east coast of Australia is rising. And that's largely just because we're into fields that are a little bit more challenging to get the gas flowing and then keep the gas flowing. So probably the marginal cost of gas is somewhere in the order of that $8 to $10 a gigajoule, which is much higher than the historical cost of probably at $3 to $5 a gigajoule. The other, I guess, key component of what drives electricity prices is obviously coal prices. So yes, it's true that we don't use coal as much as we used to, but we still use coal on the east coast for around 50–60% of our electricity generation. What this chart shows is the relatively stable coal price you can see from 2010 all the way through to 2021. That's the purple line, and that's in Australian dollars per tonne. The blue line shows the implied short-run marginal cost of burning coal in a New South Wales coal-fired power station, and that's shown on the right. That's the right-hand axis, dollars per megawatt hour. And you can see that up until 2021, wholesale prices were largely being driven by the supply-demand dynamic. They weren't being driven by the cost of coal. So you can see the cost of coal is relatively stable, but the electricity price, which is shown by the dots, was a little bit more variable than that cost structure. Then we saw what happened with the response of commodity markets to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Coal prices went to levels, again, that were unprecedented. So $600 a tonne. They've moderated somewhat, but you can see the big purple shaded area is the futures market. And you can see that, yes, it's true that we do expect coal prices in those markets, futures trading is trading them down, but still they're at levels 4 times higher than the previous record. The dots on the right show the futures pricing of electricity a week ago, and you can see that they are levels at least double the previous record for the next couple of years. So we keep coming back to what's driving the current very high and volatile spot and forward electricity prices. It's coal and gas prices. But if we think through what's the long-term outlook for energy pricing, it keeps coming back to that supply-demand balance and the cost of building new generation, which is largely capital costs. We know that those have fallen historically. There are some supply chain constraints. We're in a rising interest rate environment. You wash all that together, and that gives you a bit of a feel for what are some of the things that will drive prices up, some of the things that will drive prices down. So what went on in Q2 this year? So the first thing to note is that coal prices skyrocketed and then coal plant became unavailable. So we had a cold, wet winter, lots of flooding, and also lots of coal-fired power stations. Remember that they can't respond very well to that duck curve, that emu curve, the ramping up and ramping down because of solar. And so they fail a lot more than not. And so what this chart shows is the difference in capacity relative to a couple of months earlier in the market. And you can see that we're talking one very large coal-fired power station out for early April relative to what was thought of previously. So if we go to the next slide, we can see, I guess, part of what that then meant is that we had this trending down of coal being offered into the market. So you can see this is showing all of the coal in New South Wales and Queensland that's been offered into the market in various price buckets. And there's two key things here. Not only is the amount of coal that was offered in up until May 22 declining, it's also being offered at much higher prices. And so that had the impact of lifting the overall wholesale price, but that tight supply-demand dynamic meant that we needed to use gas. And so if you look at what filled the void because all that coal generation was unavailable, it was gas plant. And remember, we've seen what happened with that very high price of gas. So this chart shows the operation of the Tallawarra Power Station. It's in down in the south coast here in New South Wales, or in Wollongong. It operated in 2021 very sporadically. So there are times where you had very high peak demand, Tallawarra would come on just to meet those evening peaks where it's very hot, very cold. But in April and May this year, it was pretty much left on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's literally because all that coal plant fell out of the market, whether it be the mines got flooded or it was just breaking down because the coal plant is now largely all beyond its original design life. So if you're running a gas plant all of the time and the gas price has gone through the roof because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what happens is electricity prices go nuts. And so if you compare what was expected in January by the futures market, that shows in New South Wales, SA and VIC, you're expecting prices somewhere in that $70 to $90. But the actual price at mid-June, before the market was suspended, was more in that $250, $300 mark. To give you a feel for it, the previous record quarterly price was around $140 before that quarter. So you're talking double the previous record this winter. And it's all of the consequence of those coal plant failing and the gas plant being switched on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a much, much higher gas price. Now, it's a lot of people who I've kind of run this through have said to me, well, that's all well and good, Tim, but that doesn't tell me what's going to happen next winter. So is this going to happen again? I just wanted to kind of take you through this particular scenario. So about 15 years ago, two academics, including a colleague of mine, Paul Simshauser, wrote this really interesting paper that they talked about wounded bull coal generators. And what they basically said, if you've invested a bucket load of money in a big coal-fired power station, and then you've got climate policy that limits the life of that power station, you might trade it differently on the basis of a reduced, I guess, lifetime of that asset. What we've done here is we've tried to kind of replicate very simply what might happen in April and May of this year, but then looking forward into next year and the year after. We're basically saying, well, we've got this minimum demand issue where with all the renewables coming in, the amount of demand that coal has to do in that middle of the day is much, much lower than it used to be. What's the profit maximising way for coal generators to look at this? So this shows an outcome where all of the coal-fired generators stay online all through April and May, and they fight each other to stay online. So they're operating at a capacity factor at minimum demand of around 35%. So only 35% of their capacity is actually being produced at minimum demand. Now, it's true in the evening, they're probably producing more like 60, 70%, but that has a massive impact on their maintenance budget, the way that that would operate. So that you can see that the marginal price setter in this environment for both minimum and average demand is a coal-fired generator. Now, if coal it goes back to somewhat moderate levels, that's probably a pricing structure of somewhere between maybe $70 and perhaps $130. And that capacity factor is around 35% at minimum levels. That presents a somewhat challenging economic environment for those coal-fired generators. So what Q2 might have actually kind of implicitly shown a whole bunch of these coal generators is that the profit maximising thing to do is to all withdraw a unit from the bid stack. Yes, it's true that they will produce nowhere near as many megawatt hours, but if the gas unit, which in this case is Tallawarra, has to do an awful lot of production to meet average demand, that marginal price will be set by gas, which improves the total profitability. So you can see in this situation, the profitability of the industry doubles by reducing the amount of coal units online by 1 unit per portfolio. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen. This is not me making a prediction. This is in a paper that we've written merely to kind of show that this wounded bull theory is actually something that policymakers should be aware of in thinking through how to respond, I guess, to the current fuel crisis that's been going on in the East Coast. So I guess the New South Wales market, what are the things that we should be thinking about? This shows you, I guess, the New South Wales market and what we would call an optimal plant. So New South Wales has a peak demand of around 14 gigawatts, and it has an average demand of something in the order of 7, 8 gigawatts. Now, the blue line is all of the points of electricity demand. There's 17,000 points of demand plotted from highest to lowest. So these are the 5-minute demand points right across the gap. The green line shows if you remove the variable renewables, that's the amount of production that's the amount of demand you've got. Washing that through what we call an optimal plant mix economic model, we can see whether the market's long or short, whether there's too much capacity or too little capacity. So that supply-demand balance that I talked through in the sense of the drive with electricity prices. And that's shown in the table. The market's got way too much baseload capacity, and all those coal-fired generators are struggling because of that. They're all fighting the solar, fighting the wind, and they just can't really compete. And that's why at the moment, today, prices in New South Wales right now are probably negative as I'm talking to you. But the market's short peaking capacity. What's that? That's hydro fast start gas turbines that can basically turn on in the evening peaks when it's very, very cold, very, very warm. Now that's what it looks like today. But if we fast forward just a couple of years, you can see that the market is going to go through some very significant changes. Firstly, Liddell will be coming out from next year, and then the Eraring power station will close in 2025. We're going to be building a new interconnector with South Australia, which should come online probably more like 2025, but it's currently scheduled for 2024. And then we're building a bucket load of wind, a bucket load of solar, a couple of gas plants, one at Kurri Kurri, one at Chalawarra expansion. And then we're also building the super battery, the Waratah super battery. I mean, why it's called a super battery is beyond me, but that's what it's been called. It's a 750 meg battery to kind of somewhat replace the Eraring power station. But even if you wash all of those things through, the market is still actually going to be short both energy and capacity. Now, it's absolutely true that we might see more and more plants being committed to over the next couple of years, including batteries, but it's going to be tight. It's going to be very, very tight. So I think that the thing that I would take away from this slide is there's lots of plant coming out. There is some plant coming in, but it's going to be a bit bumpy along the way, would be my simple, I guess, summary of that. So I'm coming to the end of the presentation. So pricing to the last week, so the 12th of October, forward electricity prices have extended their rally. So they're really, really high. They did come off a lot in the last week and a half, and now they're on their way back up. There's a lot of uncertainty in this market. Why is there uncertainty? Coal plants are increasingly coming in and out of the market. There's lots of failing coal plants. There's also a bunch of concerns around the liquidity arrangements in the market because you've got smaller retailers who are being called upon to put more and more cash on the table with out-of-the-money positions. The way in which energy accounting works is that even if you've got generation backing your forward position, that doesn't count, and you still have to keep putting more and more cash on the table if the market position goes against you. We've seen some huge announcements the last couple of weeks. We've seen the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan. We've seen AGL announce that it's going to bring the Loy Yang plant out much, much earlier. And we've also seen the Bureau of Meteorology declare a La Nina summer for the third time in a row. So those conditions James was talking about, and I was out at Orange and Dubbo just a couple of days ago. I've spent years as a kid out there. I've never seen it that green ever. It just looked amazing. The countryside looked amazing. We've also got supply chain constraints, and we've got inflation increasing. All of that is playing through energy trading minds, and it's leading to quite a lot of volatility. But what are the things that I think we can keep coming back to? The gas price is important, even while coal generators are setting the price. So this table, we've pulled out 17,500 price and demand points in New South Wales and the rest of the NEM between 2012 and 2021, and we've worked out which generators set the price for how much percent of those 17,500 per year demand points. And you can see that over time, black and brown coal have set the price less and less, and you've seen more and more being set by hydro and VRE. Now, the key thing is that coal generators still set the price the majority of the time, but the gas prices, for some reason, still seem to be very strongly correlated with electricity prices. Why is that? Because every market participant kind of alters their bidding structure to try and force the price up to the next marginal generator, and that's gas. And with a very, very high gas price, there are inherent risks associated with a market that's increasingly doing that. So gas becomes the million-dollar question. What's the gas price going to do? And if we think through what gas prices are going to do, there's two observations that I'd make. The first is that whilst they remain elevated, they're well below the ACCC netback. So the ACCC netback price is shown there in the blue line. And there are many ways in which the ACCC calculates netback. But what it's designed to do is to say, if I produce gas and I can either send it out of Gladstone or I can send it into the domestic market, that's the price that effectively removes all of the costs of getting it outside of Australia. So shipping costs, liquefaction, those types of costs. And you can see that the domestic costs, which are in those squiggly lines at the bottom of the chart, they're much higher than they've ever been, but they're a lot lower than the net back price. So it's unclear why that's the case, because rationally, if you're a gas producer, you'd be selling it, if you didn't care at all about Australian industry, you'd be selling it at those much, much higher prices. So clearly the gas industry is somewhat trying its best to play ball and meet domestic requirements. And a lot of that is due to this piece of agreement that was entered into between the government and gas producers. But the key point here is that Q2 and Q3 prices next year, so that winter period, the gas forward prices are much, much higher than where they are currently sitting today at $15 to $20 a gigajoule. So that's why you're still hearing talk about the government intervening around gas prices. And remember, for each dollar per gigajoule reduction in gas price, it translates to roughly $8 per megawatt hour in electricity. So I'm not allowed to tell you what I think gas electricity prices will do, but I can tell you that all roads lead you to whatever the government does in terms of its impact on gas price, it will have a material impact on next year and the year after electricity price. Certainly, they're not going to come back down to where they were 18 months ago unless you see that fall away in coal prices as well. But the long term, I keep coming back to the cost of generation is still much, much lower from renewables, even with firmed. And the longer the tenor of the arrangement you enter into with the retailer, the better the price you're going to get, even in the front. But I've gone on for long enough now. I might stay up here and happy to answer any questions that just
Okay, well, thank you, Tim. Now we will go on to our question and answer session. So I'll invite both Tim, James, as well as Adam back over here. So we can start with some of the questions that we've already got. Please feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom in order to just keep providing questions. In the meantime, I'll start asking some of the questions I've already received. So I'll start with the first question. With the recent discussion on government intervention on gas prices, how does Iberdrola view is impacting forward energy prices?
It's a very, very good question. So at the moment, the Q2, Q3 price for winter next year is currently sitting in probably that $40 a gigajoule range. That has a massive impact on electricity prices. Very roughly speaking, the heat rate of a gas-fired peaking power station is probably going to be somewhere in that 10 gigajoules per megawatt hour. So at $40 per gigajoule, you multiply that by 10, that gives you the electricity price. It's around $400 a megawatt hour. And at various points during the very kind of high price period over winter just gone, a lot of that was because we were seeing gas prices at $40 a gigajoule. So the government's clearly aware of that, and they're saying, look, it's just unreasonable, given we have so much gas in Australia that people would pay $40 a gigajoule for a product that effectively feeds into an essential service. That's the government's thinking. We're hearing lots of talk about, potentially capping prices, those types of things. In reality, the government has to walk a fine balance between if it caps the price too significantly. I've heard people saying that they think gas should be priced at $10 a gigajoule. That will have a massive impact on the disincentivization of people producing more gas. So there's a fine line between pushing the price down to a point where industry can still be competitive and people's electricity bills don't go through the roof. But they also need to make sure that they don't crush it too hard, in which case all the gas producers go, it's just all too hard, I'm not going to do this anymore. So if I had to give my personal view, I suspect that probably lands you somewhere between $15 and $25. But again, that's a personal view. It's not backed by any science, it's just that I feel. Yeah.
Okay. We'll move on to the next question. What's Iberdrola's view on the transition of renewables in respect to barriers of entry with renewable generation progressing into the market over the coming years?
Do you want me to take that? All right.
I actually think the great thing about renewables is that it democratizes energy. So not only can each individual take control, so whether it's a home putting a solar PV and a battery on, but councils can do the same thing. Anyone who's got a roof can basically start owning part of the electricity production chain. But the other key benefit of renewables is that you can build a relatively small solar farm or a relatively small wind farm at a fraction of the cost that it needs to kind of build a big coal-fired power station. So to build a brand new Liddell, you'd be looking at $4 billion, probably, maybe even more, $5 billion. Attracting $5 billion of finance is not kind of an easy thing to do. It's really challenging. So there are only a handful of companies in Australia that can even do it. Whereas I know it sounds that it's still quite a big barrier, but building a 20 megawatt solar farm is probably a $30, $50 million exercise. That is a big amount of money, but it's something that hundreds, perhaps thousands of companies can do, not just a couple of big businesses. And the other great thing about renewables is that companies like Iberdrola are building up these smaller portfolios that enable us to know what our cost structure is. And therefore, the market's important for us because, we buy and sell into it because it's a gross pool. But it means that we can take somewhat control of that cost structure and pass the benefits on. And that's not just us, that's anyone who's building renewables can do that for their customers.
We have some more interesting questions here. This one is about solar farms. The solar farms developed are hopefully not on good agricultural land. If so, how do you cope with it?
Oh, that's a tough question because some solar plants have been built on what I would kind of consider to be pretty decent kind of agricultural land. There's one in particular out in the central west I can think of that did attract a lot of community opposition because it was seen to utilise that type of land. So I'd say site selection is going to be a really, really important one. The government's framework for renewable energy zones, though, is kind of considering that about where they're building these new transmission corridors, making sure that they've got sites that aren't utilising land in that way. I have heard some farmers welcome solar plants on because if they're constructed in a certain way, they can actually coexist with sheep grazing and those types of things. Certainly they can't coexist properly. But it's a good question and it's probably not an easy answer.
I guess it's every council probably needs to take set rules for itself, I guess. And this will all be, I guess, a journey every council will need to take. We'll go on to the next question. Is there any new gas sources likely to come online in the next year or two on the East Coast that would reduce the gas cost?
There's certainly lots of activity. Whether it will come on in sufficient quantities, I probably am not best placed to answer. Where I think there is a big opportunity, and I do think local government has a huge role to play here. We Australians, and I'm guilty of this, we use gas for such low value use. So I've got gas hot water, I've got a gas stove. Heating water using gas is probably such a low efficiency. And when gas prices are high, the smart thing for me to do personally would be to rip out my gas hot water system, put in a heat pump. I'd save heaps of money. I can use the solar in the middle of the day with the heat pump. So I think with gas supply demand, as much as new gas supply is really important, part of, I think, the challenge for Australia is to actually free up gas to go into high value use. So high value use are things like, but there's not a lot of other opportunity to use electricity or other fuels to do that economic activity. Peaking power generation is a much higher value use for gas than heating my shower, basically.
Well, some would argue your shower is actually important.
Particularly these two standing over the side.
Yes. Moving on to the next question. Assuming the market share of renewables will increase into the future and their cost of generation is not based on the price of the commodity, that is coal, I expect that the price would remain relatively constant for generation. Why do long-term PPAs that are being offered appear to be based on futures market rather than cost of generation?
So a lot of it comes down to when the renewables are going to produce. So the reason firming is such a valuable part of what a retailer can provide
provide is that the best way to explain this is, let's just assume today, a cloud suddenly, big cloud system suddenly goes over the majority of solar in New South Wales. We've seen when the price goes from negative 100 to 14,000 in a 5-minute increment. So what the spot market does is really elegantly dispatch energy that's available in real time. And what the futures market is meant to do is give a feel for, if you aggregate all of those expectations about what's going to happen in the next 3 years, that gives you a number. Where I think that people kind of confuse those concepts, when they start talking about a PPA, in my mind, is a really blunt instrument that's not very helpful for either the buyer or the seller. And let me give you a really good example in South Australia. At the moment in South Australia, huge amounts of renewables get curtailed because when the price gets negative, they all turn off because they don't want to be paying to stay online. If you then think about, well, what about a renewable that's been sold as a fixed retail contract? They actually are quite happy to keep generating because they know the customer needs that energy at that point in time. And so they've done their maths that way. It's all because that they're dealing with that firming issue. And I think what we're going to see is more and more of this, building a portfolio of renewables, firming it up, and just providing a standard retail price. Because that gives the customer what they want, which is green energy, but also reliable energy that they're not having to go and find somebody else to firm it up. So my personal views, I think PPAs will kind of go the way of the dodo, because I just don't think they're helpful to the buyer or the seller.
So eventually we only have one year or fixed prices consistently.
Yeah.
Without any PPAs or anything.
Yeah, so maybe a 10-year fixed price agreement. So I think, well, the longest contract on our books is now, I think, something like 8 to 10 years. That's kind of fixed. And that's because we know what our costs roughly look like. And, it's in our interest and in our customers' interest to have some degree of certainty about what we're going to both be seeing. So, I think that's probably more likely the way.
And look, it's our job to manage that risk because we're in the market day in, day out. I think sort of one of the common misconceptions with PPAs, they're cheap and it's going to solve all the problems. But when you have a run-of-plant supply, and you don't have that firming around the outside. And we've especially seen this year with just the extreme market volatility, if you're exposed to that spot market when the plant is either not running or running lower than your load, you have really extreme price exposure. And I think that's starting to be felt this year. Some of the discussions that we're having with customers at the moment too. So we've sort of pivoted to more that, structure with backward renewables with our firming assets and giving that sort of certainty at the time.
Okay, sounds good. And having that certainty, especially for the local government sector, is really important because energy is quite a significant portion of their OPEX, and having all that fluctuation in their balance sheet is very, well, let's just say it's not comfortable. There are lots of questions about the presentation and the webinar recording. I will just let you all know that the presentation and the webinar recording will be available after this, online on our website. We will send you an email with the links and the right after, in about a week's time, once it's all set up. Are there any further questions that you'd still like to ask? Because I think these are all the questions I have.
While people are thinking of questions, I just keep going back to, if you don't have solar, get solar. If you take nothing else out of today's presentation, then for both councils and you and your personal life, get solar.
Okay, so we do have one question, and now that we did ask the question, will it help reduce the current prices if more domestic solar panels are installed?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. The more solar you put in, the more it drives batteries, and batteries are somewhat the antidote to the current crisis. So if we weren't relying upon gas as much as we were, we had bucket loads of batteries to get us through those evening peaks. You could basically ride the solar, put all that solar in. And the great thing about solar is that, and I know this is a poor outcome from an environmental perspective, but the more solar you put in, the less pressure it puts on those coal-fired generators to act in a really kind of sub-economic way. But then the batteries charge up and there's too much solar, and then they provide that peak, so you don't have to build more generating assets just to get you through between when we all get home and we turn on the heater in the middle of winter. And that could get worse because we're all substituting out gas heating for reverse cycle heating as we are all doing that.
Yeah, we might have time for one more question in case you have any. Okay, just coming through.
If yes. If yes.
If yes, what training is currently provided to the public? Maybe go with the education.
Training on
Just the solar panels and installation of solar panels and how to use all of them to manage.
it's a really good question actually, because solar is largely a set and forget. So we don't do residential solar, but for resi, it is largely set and forget. Most of the companies install the software that goes with it. For councils, we'd be more than happy to make our experts available on how to kind of think about solar. Jimmy, I'm speaking for you there. Look, it is pretty common for a lot of councils we talk to either have solar already, and then looking at next steps potentially about batteries and how can they optimise the amount of solar they have and how much power they dispatch to the market at the right times. And then the next step is how can they actually monetize that. So that's having a financially responsible market participant, which is a long word for a retailer, to actually enable that revenue stream. So, you know, we're involved in various stages, be that, you know, modelling from first principles all the way through to what does a virtual power plant or VPP look like by optimising the council's solar and battery assets and what is the revenue stream out of that. So yeah, we're at various stages of the way we're pulling that data.
Perfect. So, so I guess the takeaway is just ask us a question. We'll help answer it. Right? It's as simple as that. Look, I think that there might be another question coming through. I'll just give it a minute for it to load up. Yes, here we go. How can councils put more solar on sites that don't use it behind the meter? It would be great if we could offset it at another site if we need it.
Yeah, but we do get asked that quite a bit, and some of our existing customers do exactly that. So we offer basically our solar net off club programs, whereas essentially, you know, you might have a warehouse, or if you're more rural, a big parcel of land, we basically enable connection to the grid, feeds into the grid. There's revenue stream to that. It's, I like to say, simple. It's quite technical setting up in the back end, but the product is quite simple to be able to really wash that revenue across invoices for other council sites, or if there's an arrangement where councils banding together across other council areas where you might have a house in a rural area with a lot of space, you can put the solar on. I guess maybe a city council with a lot less space, maybe an arrangement there where we can look at sort of washing that revenue across different areas. So yeah, it does exist at the moment. Yeah, we'll maybe have a look.
Yeah, so I guess the takeaway here is that there are lots and lots of options. I think a lot of the options that will work for you will be very unique to your situation. So again, just have a chat. We'll find that good option for you. The next question is, what about offshore wind generation?
So Victoria has pretty much announced that that's where they're going to go. They're going to go down the pathway of offshore. I've got mixed feelings about offshore. So Iberdrola is very big globally on offshore, but generally where Iberdrola deploys offshore wind is where there's very little land to build wind farms. So I think, kind of Europe, where you've got, very, very kind of urban, dense kind of, all the way kind of right through Western Europe and the UK. Offshore wind is much more expensive. So it's probably double the cost of conventional onshore. The most important thing with a wind farm is to make sure not only the site is windy, but also that the community and the landholders welcome the investment and welcome the opportunity that the wind farm might bring. So I think in Victoria, they've more or less of what we think of running out of space where that's going to occur. So we're going to go offshore. In New South Wales, we do have a lot of space where solar and wind make sense. As somebody who grew up in the central and far west of New South Wales, the biggest challenge is actually the grid. And so that's why the New South Wales government's building out renewable energy zones, central west of Rana, then New England, and then the southwest. They're also now talking about building offshore wind. Offshore wind, though, is probably at least 6 years away in the sense of being on the ground working, simply because it takes so long to develop and build. It certainly probably will have a role, but I think that probably in New South Wales, we're a long way away from offshore becoming the main component of our energy supply. Foreshadowing any questions that ask where's a good spot for a wind farm, you're probably looking at rule of thumb average wind speed of about 7.5. Did you get any questions?
Okay, so put a gauge outside your council, see if it's 7.5 meters per second. We'll have a wind farm for you there.
But the other great irony though is that generally it's windier. So kind of like in terms of agriculture, again, being somebody who kind of spent a bit of time kind of growing up out in Central West, generally speaking, the more hilly the terrain, generally the less farmers wanted it because they like a nice flat, we do cropping, grazing, that type of stuff. Where the wind farms actually kind of tend to go is kind of on the hills because that's where they get the most wind. So a lot of people who've probably got property that they think, oh, it's only marginal from a farming perspective, they can actually do really nicely with talking about hosting a wind farm on their property. It's not for everyone, but for people who do welcome it, it can actually be a really good outcome from just a revenue generation perspective. So depending upon kind of what their perspective on it looks like.
Back in the day, people used to pray for oil to come out of their land, and now it's hills because you can put in wind farms there. So life is changing quite a bit. And look, we are just about out of time. So I would like to just start wrapping this up a little bit. I'd just like to start with sharing some key takeaways that I personally took away from this. Firstly, solar is a great investment. I think we've heard it so many times. We've got to mention that. Solar is a great investment, and so if you haven't done it already, do it. We can help you with it. They can help you with it. A lot of people can help you with this, right? So really look into it if you haven't done it already. Now, the other thing is that I realized was that there's a duct type demand that comes in, a duct demand curve as all of these renewables come online. And so what that does is it stresses all of the coal-fired power plants quite a fair bit. And the coal-fired power plants are not used to operating in that way. They're always, all guns blazing pretty much all the time. They're not meant to be closed. So you will have a lot more maintenance that they will require. You will have a lot of outages that they will have. With gas and coal prices as key input into these coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants, 60% of all energy that we still have in the state is still coming from these sources. So as these prices are going to be up, electricity prices are naturally going to be up, and we are going to see a lot of volatility in the space. We have a lot of new renewable coming online, but it is a couple of years away, and we have clear-cut deadlines of coal-fired power plants shutting down. So it will be a bumpy ride. Eventually, when everything does come online, it might become better, but there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of ambiguity, and so a lot of it is just about how we manage, how we hedge, how we just plan for the future, given all of this uncertainty, because it's just a way of life now. And I guess these were some of my main takeaways. At this point, what I'd like to do is I'd just like to thank Tim, James, as well as Adam for their time on this webinar. I would also like to thank Selena, Kieran, and John in the back here who've been helping out with this webinar. I would like to also put in the reminder of the wind farm tour that Adam had just talked about. We will send all of the webinar attendees an email on how to register your interest for the web farm tour. It's going to be on the 17th of November, and there are only about 20 odd places available. So we would love to see you there. Do register your interest in case you are interested as soon as that does come out. I will again remind you that the recording of the webinar as well as the slides and presentations are going to be available on the website. We will send you all an email with all of the information there once it's available. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you as the participants for being so engaging and providing such thought-provoking questions to everybody here. So thank you very much.